My name is Claire Jennings, and I always believed that Christmas was supposed to be the one night of the year when even broken families pretended to be whole. I was 28 that December, standing in my parents' living room with the smell of pine needles and cinnamon candles drifting through the air and a tree glowing in the corner. Relatives laughed softly over mulled wine, while a carol promised joy to the world, and I told myself to hold steady and get through the night. I had wrapped small gifts for cousins. I had set the table for my mother. I had tried to act like peace was possible. But peace in this house had always been a fragile disguise. When my father crooked his finger for me to come closer, I felt the weight of years settle on my shoulders. We stepped into the front hallway where the draft came in from the old door, and he leaned down with eyes that no longer hid what they wanted. He told me to sign the deed tonight to hand over the property that my grandfather had left in my name to make it my Christmas gift to my brother. I said no, and he smiled without warmth, the kind of smile that comes before a blow. He lifted my hand as if to admire a ring and then closed around it like a clamp. His thumb pressed into the small joint and his fingers wrapped mine in a grip so tight my bones screamed. Slowly he began to bend my index finger back steady and cruel as though he had practiced this kind of lesson before. A hot white bolt shot up my arm and the music from the living room blurred. He told me that a good daughter sacrifices that loyalty is measured in ink and obedience. I said, love is not a signature on command, and the look in his eyes turned colder than the frost outside. My brother wandered into the doorway with a drink in hand and said I should stop being childish and give them what they wanted. He smirked while my father bent my middle finger back next, and the pressure built until the joint threatened to snap. My breath fractured and I stared at the brass knob of the door because it was the only still thing I could find. I remembered the clean lines of the deed in my drawer, my name written where my grandfather had trusted it would be safe, and I understood that he had known nights like this might come. My father pressed harder, and a sharp pop echoed through my hand, not broken yet, but warning me of what he was willing to do. The pain rattled my ribs, and the faces in the room shifted, but no one moved to stop him. My mother whispered that I should be a good girl and end this quietly, and my brother lifted his glass as if this were entertainment. Something inside me split then not with bone, but with clarity. This was not anger or a slip. This was a plan, a ritual dressed as family tradition, a way to make me surrender what was mine. I said, let go of my hand. He did not. I said, I will not sign. He pushed harder until my vision blurred. In that moment, the word rose from my mouth, clear and undeniable. This is assault. The silence after was heavier than the hymns still playing. A few faces flinched, though their bodies stayed still. He paused only long enough for me to wrench my hand back and hold it to my chest. Red marks bloomed across my skin and my fingers throbbed in waves. He called me dramatic and ungrateful, said I was ruining Christmas. I looked at the tree glowing in the corner at the star shining above it, and I realized I would never bend again. I walked through the gathered family, their careful eyes sliding away, and the song promised peace on earth. But in my chest, another promise had formed. This night had ended one story and begun another, and I would make sure they learned the meaning of justice. And the truth behind that Christmas night did not begin with tinsel and carols, but months earlier when a white envelope from the county recorder reminded me that my grandfather had trusted me with more than stories. The property was a rectangle of pasture and a weathered farmhouse at the edge of town, where maples turned the road into a tunnel each October. I had spent 2 summers there after college, carrying buckets to the garden and helping him patch shingles while he said that steadiness was a kind of courage. On the day he signed the deed, he wore his good hat and asked me to drive him to the notary. He said the land should belong to the person who showed up when work was quiet and when work was hard. He did not say my brother should not have it, and he did not have to. Ryan rarely visited unless there was a barbecue. My father liked to say that sons inherit burdens and daughters inherit advice. My grandfather said nothing to that, only handed me the pen and pointed to the line with my name already printed. After he passed, I kept the deed rolled with a ribbon in my desk, and I made copies for a fireproof box because the women in my family had taught me to prepare for weather that did not appear on forecasts. For a while, nothing changed. I visited my parents on Sundays, brought pies, answered questions about work, and left before the old arguments woke up. In late September, my father asked me to stay after dinner. He sat with a legal pad and explained that the property should sit in a family trust with Ryan as future manager because that would spare us taxes and trouble. I recognized the little trick of wrapping a demand in gentle words. I asked why Ryan should manage land I owned. My mother said because men carry the load outside the house and women carry the load inside. I asked whether roof repairs counted as inside or outside. She did not laugh. My father wrote quitclaim in a box on the paper and told me not to fuss with legal terms, that signatures were just family manners in ink. I took the papers home and read until midnight and learned that a quitclaim would erase my interest entirely and leave me at the mercy of promises spoken across a table. When I returned the papers unsigned, my father said I was letting pride ruin good sense. Ryan sent a text asking if I really thought I could manage acreage when I could not keep a plant alive in my apartment, so I bought a basil and watered it every morning because pettiness has its uses. October brought more attempts. My mother called to say a church friend who handled estates had confirmed a trust was best. I asked for the name and number, and she told me not to be disrespectful. At her counter, I found a glossy packet from a realtor, and she said I would be safer with cash than with dirt and shingles. She spoke about timing and about how a sister should help a brother get his start. I asked when exactly my brother would start helping himself. She dabbed her eye and said girls should not talk that way about family. Later, I learned she had told my aunts I was thinking of selling to strangers and that my parents would end up homeless if I did not cooperate. An aunt squeezed my arm at a birthday party and called me clever in a way that sounded like cunning rather than smart. My father did not raise his voice then. He preferred cooler tools. He poured coffee and talked about legacy and about pouring concrete in the rain and about how easy it must be to inherit. I still believed we could reach an adult agreement if I did not give him a reason to push harder. In November, I drove to the farmhouse to check the pipes and found Ryan in the driveway with a tape measure and a friend I did not know. He said they were mapping where the new garage would go once the paperwork was finished, and he slapped the hood of his truck as if the title already lived in his back pocket. I said there would be no paperwork because I had not agreed to any change. He laughed and said Dad would handle me. I told him I was not a thing to be handled, and the friend studied the trees like a witness who would not forget. Thanksgiving gathered us again. My parents invited a neighbor with a cousin at a bank who explained financing options to me while I carved turkey. My mother announced I had something important to share and stood with her hands folded while the room turned to me. I said I had only thanks to share. My father repeated "be reasonable" until the words lost shape. When the dishes were done, he cornered me by the pantry and said family unity mattered more than paperwork and that stubbornness could be a sin. He said he could not sleep while land sat idle when it could be placed where it belonged. I asked where he thought it belonged. He said with the son who would carry the family name. When I said names do not carry houses, he closed his eyes like a man praying and then opened them with a stare that felt like a door shutting. December began with polite distance. We spoke without saying much. I found the farmhouse back door unlocked and a pile of catalogs on the table with pages marked for a riding mower and a jet ski. Ryan had left a note that said we can have nice things if you stop being difficult. I folded it flat and slid it under the ribbon on the deed because symbols help when the facts turn messy. I hung a short string of lights on the porch because my grandfather had loved the glow and said light is a way to tell dark it cannot have the last word. 2 days later, my father called and asked if I could come by after work to talk through final details before Christmas. He sounded calm and almost kind. I went because hope is a stubborn habit. He had fresh papers waiting, crisp lines, a pen laid across the top. I read them while he watched like a foreman watches a clock. I said no again and pushed the pen back. He said I was pushing away the only people who would ever stand with me. I told him a crowd is not always the same as support. That sentence was still ringing in my head on Christmas night when the music played and the tree glowed and he crooked his finger for me to come. The weeks after that phone call moved like wet cement, heavy and slow. Every conversation in my parents' house waited with what had not been signed. My mother perfected her rehearsed sighs and let them out at church potlucks, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter was being ungrateful that she was sitting on property while her poor brother struggled to start his life. Ryan leaned into the role of martyr, showing up at family gatherings with dramatic talk of lost opportunities, how a good sister would stand behind her brother instead of in front of him, Neighbors repeated his words back to me in the grocery store aisle, asking why I was making things so hard. When I told them the truth, they tilted their heads as if truth was impolite. At home, I found myself checking locks twice, triple latching the door, because whispers can crawl under the frame. My father used subtler tools. He called me on a Wednesday evening while I was finishing a report and said he had found a buyer who would pay me out quickly, no strings, all cash. He told me this was my chance to prove I was not selfish. I said my chance was already written in my name on the deed, and he hung up without goodbye. The next Sunday at dinner, he placed his hand on my shoulder, heavy and final, and told me the family had voted as if ownership were determined by numbers at a table rather than law. I told him democracy did not apply to deeds. He squeezed until my collarbone ached and whispered that stubbornness could be broken. I left with food still steaming on the plates. Ryan followed me into the driveway smirking and said Dad was right, that resistance was just a stage that eventually I would understand my place. His words were cold metal in my ear, and I drove home shaking, gripping the wheel until my knuckles burned. Nights became fractured with waking images of hands around mine. The smell of old wood in the farmhouse, my grandfather's voice telling me to prepare for storms. I began writing everything down, dates and words, each demand, each threat, each attempt to corner me. I saved texts, printed them, slipped them into a folder. I told myself documentation is not paranoia, it is survival. Still, every gathering felt like a theater where I was cast as villain. Thanksgiving confirmed it. When I refused to sign papers, my mother put down her fork, tears sliding down her face with theatrical precision, and said she did not know how much longer her health could endure stress. She pressed a hand to her chest, and Ryan passed her a glass of water like an assistant in a well-rehearsed play. Relatives shifted in their chairs, muttering that family should come first. My father sat at the head of the table and said nothing, just stared at me with the patience of a man who believes time will eventually do his work. After the meal, I heard him telling Ryan in the garage that leverage only works if applied at the right moment. I stepped back into the shadows and wrote the sentence in my phone, word for word. When December came, so did new strategies. My mother wrapped an envelope in red paper and handed it to me with a trembling smile. Inside was another set of forms, this time presented as an early Christmas gift, a chance to be done with conflict. I folded the papers in half and gave them back. She called me cruel and said no daughter should humiliate her mother like that. My father began to speak in phrases meant to bruise without leaving marks. He told me no man would ever want a woman who fought her own family. He told me independence was just loneliness with a better name. He told me if I kept going, I would end up old and forgotten. Ryan echoed him in texts, calling me bitter, saying property meant nothing if family ties were severed. But in each line I heard the fear that without my signature they could not move me. Each attempt to weaken me became another brick in a wall of resolve. Still, the air in that house thickened, and I knew they were building towards something larger, a public scene, where they would try to break me for good. I underestimated just how far they were willing to go until Christmas Eve arrived, the night when music promised peace and family gathered, and my father crooked his finger for me to come. The room shimmered with candlelight that Christmas Eve cousins passing plates of ham and sweet rolls while a carol floated from the stereo, promising joy to the world, but the joy never touched me. My father stood from his chair at the head of the table and called me forward, his voice steady but his eyes carrying the same demand they had carried for months. He said before everyone that it was time to put the matter to rest, that a daughter should not hold land hostage when her brother's future was at stake. My mother nodded along her hands, folded like a saint in a stained glass window, while Ryan leaned back with a smirk as though he were already the owner. I told them this was not the night for legal fights and that I would not sign. My father's face darkened, and he stepped toward me, pushing aside a chair as guests fell silent. He wrapped his hand around mine and twisted my fingers back in plain view of everyone. A sharp crack of strain filled the air, and my cry cut through the music. Someone gasped, but no one moved. My father hissed that obedience was the only true gift I could give. Ryan laughed into his glass and told me to stop being a child. My mother pressed her lips together, torn between the show of horror and the satisfaction of seeing pressure applied. I begged him to let go, but he pushed harder, slow and merciless bending until the joint throbbed with fire. My vision blurred, yet my voice rose, and I shouted, "This is assault!" The word shocked the air, but he did not stop. He said, "Family is not a courtroom. Family is loyalty, and loyalty means surrender." Guests shifted uncomfortably. Plates, half-lifted forks, suspended, but none came forward. The humiliation seared deeper than the pain, knowing that an entire room would witness and yet remain still. He bent my finger farther, and I heard a faint pop, not broken, but close enough to slice terror through my chest. I yanked my hand free and clutched it to my ribs. My father shouted that I was disgracing him, that no daughter of his would deny her brother. My mother finally gasped in performance more than concern and whispered that I should not ruin Christmas. Ryan leaned close and whispered that I should think how lonely the new year would feel when family cut me off. I straightened, shaking but unbowed, and declared I would never sign not tonight, not ever. The room was silent, only the hymn promising peace, while my heart pounded with something harder than rage, something colder than fear. I walked out of the circle of light past the tree, glittering with ornaments past the gifts wrapped in bows, my hand throbbing, my soul steady. At the door, I turned my eyes, sweeping the room, and I saw them all frozen complicit in silence. My father's chest heaved, my mother's eyes brimmed with false tears. Ryan's grin faltered for the first time. I opened the door to the cold night and promised myself I would not return until justice sat at the table where loyalty had been twisted into chains. That Christmas, I understood my family had declared war on me, but they had also taught me the shape of their cruelty. They thought pain would bend me. They were wrong. The cold bit into my skin as I stepped outside, and while my fingers still throbbed from his grip, my mind sharpened like glass. I understood then that silence was no shield, that walking away meant nothing if I returned empty-handed. Back in my apartment, Daniel weighted his jaw tight as he looked at the red marks across my hand. He said we needed to do something more than survive the night, that this was not just a slap or a shove, but an assault that could repeat unless we drew a line. I nodded and pulled out the folder I had built each page, a record of words, threats, and manipulations. I told him my grandfather had not only given me the deed, but had given me foresight, that trust was not naive, it was preparation. We spread the papers on the table, the copies of texts from Ryan mocking me the dates when my mother cornered me with her size, the realtor pamphlets she slipped under my nose, the unsigned trust forms. At the bottom lay the deed itself with my name printed in clean ink, the one thing they could not erase. Daniel said a lawyer would know exactly what to do, and I remembered the woman who had helped with a housing project at work, precise and relentless. The next morning, we sat in her office while she adjusted her glasses and read through the folder. She looked up and said the case was clear, that I was the legal owner, that any further attempt to coerce me could be challenged in court as undue pressure, that the assault itself could be reported. She asked if I was ready to pursue it. My hand still ached, my pride still burned, but more than that, a new certainty had settled in me. I said yes, but not yet in court. I wanted them to see me stand, to know the strength they had underestimated. We drafted a formal letter embossed firm but polite, reminding them of the recorded ownership and warning that any future interference would result in legal action. I mailed it in gold envelope with deliberate elegance, knowing the message would sting more dressed in respect than rage. 2 days later, my phone rang. My mother's voice trembled not with sorrow, but with panic. She asked what the envelope meant. I said it meant the house was mine, that the land was mine, that nothing they said could undo that. She tried to plead her words, running into excuses about my father's health, about Ryan's struggles, about the burden of tradition. I reminded her of the bruise on my hand of the night when silence filled the room, while my father tried to break me. She fell quiet then, and in that pause, I heard the truth they had never expected me to hold. I hung up, and Daniel squeezed my unbroken fingers, and I felt steadier than I had in months. That weekend, we went back to the farmhouse, and I walked the perimeter of the land boots, crunching frost the winter sun pale over the fields. I imagined turning this space into something that carried my name not as a burden, but as a promise. They had wanted me powerless, but here I stood with proof that resilience could be written into deeds as surely as into bones. My father had declared war, but I now carried the weapon of law, of truth, of resolve. The battle had shifted, and for the first time, I believed I could win. The letter was only the first strike a reminder in ink that I was not a daughter to be ordered like furniture, but the owner of the house they had called theirs for 20 years. The following week, the phone rang every evening. My mother first, with her cracked voice rehearsing grief, then Ryan shouting that I was tearing the family apart, then my father gruff and cold, telling me I would regret humiliating him. I let most calls go to voicemail. When I answered, my words were steady. I said the deed was not a toy, that my decision was not up for debate, and that next time they wanted to discuss ownership, they could bring a lawyer to the table. Their rage spilled wider. At church, my mother whispered to old friends that I was unwell, that grief had warped me, that I was being manipulated by outsiders. Ryan posted vague lines online about betrayal, about sisters who forgot their blood. My father told neighbors I had been led astray by greed. I documented everything, clipping posts, saving messages, printing screenshots. My lawyer encouraged me to prepare a protective order not only against physical assault, but against harassment, and for the first time, I felt law was not a weapon in their hands, but a shield in mine. Daniel urged me to step further. He said, "Truth shrinks in silence," that if I wanted to stop them, I needed to let others see. So I sat one evening and wrote my story stripping names but not details about a family who tried to twist loyalty into ownership, about a father who tried to break my fingers at Christmas to secure land that was not his. I posted it on a community board. By morning, dozens of responses poured in, strangers writing that they saw their own fathers, their own brothers, their own mothers in my words. Support blossomed where isolation had lived. My mother called furious, her voice high, demanding I take it down, saying I was airing dirty laundry. I told her the laundry had been stained long before I showed it. Ryan threatened to sue for defamation, but my lawyer laughed and said truth cannot be defamed. Then came the night when my father showed up at my door. He stood on the porch with the winter air steaming from his breath, and he told me he was still my father, that the land was still his in spirit, that I had no right to shame him before the town. I held the doorframe with one hand, the deed in the other, and I told him fatherhood is not ownership, and spirit does not override law. His eyes narrowed, his fists clenched, but he did not cross the threshold. I realized then that the boundary I had drawn was stronger than blood. Weeks later, the county clerk recorded a restriction order in my favor, a paper that declared distance must be kept, that any act of coercion could bring police. Ryan's smugness faltered. My mother's theatrics grew shrill, and my father grew quiet. Nursing pride bruised deeper than my hand. Their power slipped because I refused to surrender. For the first time, the war was tilted in my favor. At work, I walked straighter at night. I slept longer. And when I touched the deed, I felt not the weight of inheritance, but the pulse of independence. They had tried to bend me until I snapped. Instead, I had hardened into steel. The backlash came like a slow tide that could not be stopped once the truth was set loose. My father's silence at church was louder than any hymn. His shoulders rigid when neighbors no longer offered their easy smiles. Whispers traveled across pews that he had raised his hand against me on Christmas night, that he had tried to twist my fingers until they snapped. My mother tried to salvage the story, claiming I had exaggerated, claiming stress had muddled my memory, but the bruise across my knuckles spoke louder. When Ryan applied for a bank loan to fund his expansion plans, the officer asked about collateral and the farmhouse, but the records showed it was mine alone. The loan was denied. He stormed to my door, shouting that I had destroyed his future. I stood behind the locked glass and told him his future was never mine to build. Soon after, extended relatives stopped visiting my parents' house. Invitations to community dinners arrived at my mailbox, but not theirs. The same friends my mother had leaned on for sympathy now crossed the street to avoid her. My father's temper, once a weapon, turned inward, gnawing at him, leaving him a brittle man snapping at shadows. He told anyone who would listen that his daughter was ungrateful that he had given me everything, but even those who wanted to believe him found his voice too bitter. Ryan lost his job at a dealership when videos surfaced of him mocking me online. The manager said he could not keep someone who ridiculed family violence survivors while customers listened. He cursed my name as though my refusal had cursed his own path. My mother called sobbing, saying bills were piling, that her husband's pride was killing them, that I should step in before it was too late. I asked her where she had been when his hand closed over mine, when he bent my finger and the room watched. She hung up without answer. For the first time in my life, I felt their desperation pressing harder than their power. They tried to corner me once more, showing up together at the farmhouse gate, faces drawn, voices shaky. My father demanded I rescind the order that I let them back into the house that had sheltered them for decades. I looked at the peeling paint on the porch and at the frost ramming the fence, and I told them the house was no longer theirs, not in deed, not in spirit. My mother begged, saying my father's health was failing, that stress had broken his heart. I told her broken hearts cannot excuse broken bones. Ryan cursed me, calling me cold, and I reminded him that warmth had never come from cruelty. They left in silence, their car heavy with boxes of their life. I watched them go without triumph, but with the steady knowledge that choices carry consequence. Weeks later, a notice was nailed to the door of the house they had moved into with Ryan. The landlord was evicting them for missed payments. Word spread fast, and pity was scarce. My father, once respected, was now pitied in whispers as the man who tried to crush his daughter for land and lost everything instead. Ryan drifted from job to job, his arrogance shrinking each time someone mentioned his sister's name with respect instead of shame. My mother's calls grew shorter, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, but each ended with silence when I refused to bend. The power they had once wielded was gone, replaced by consequences they had sown themselves. Their punishment was not my invention, it was the weight of truth pressing down. And as winter thinned and spring thawed the ground around the farmhouse, I walked the fields, knowing justice was not an act of revenge, but a mirror. They had chosen their reflection, and now they could not look away. Spring carried a softer light across the fields, and the snow melted into dark soil where green shoots pressed upward, and each morning I walked the land my grandfather had trusted to me, and felt the echo of his voice telling me storms would come, but so would dawn. My fingers had healed, though faint ridges marked where his grip had pressed, and every time I flexed them, I remembered that night when silence filled a room while my father tried to break me. Yet memory no longer crushed me, it steeled me. Daniel and I began planning what to do with the property, and the idea grew between us that the house could become more than shelter for one. We reached out to a nonprofit focused on women escaping family violence, and soon architects visited tracing lines on paper for a center that would rise on the land my family had tried to strip from me. At the opening meeting, I spoke carefully, telling the story not with rage, but with clarity about how family can sometimes be the first battlefield, about how love twisted into control is not love at all. The room listened, eyes wet, and when applause came, it felt like a wave lifting me higher than any holiday song ever had. My mother sent a letter soon after, written in her hand, accusing me of spite of destroying what was ours, never once apologizing. I read it by the fire and then fed it to the flames, watching smoke curl like the past fading into night. My father never came again, too weighed by pride and shame, but I sometimes imagined him driving past, seeing walls rebuilt into something new, realizing the property had been reborn as sanctuary instead of throne. Ryan crossed paths with me months later outside a grocery store, thinner eyes darting. He muttered that I had ruined him, that our parents now lived cramped in his apartment. I looked at him and said he had ruined himself long before, when he smirked while our father tried to break me. He said nothing, then just looked away. By autumn, the shelter was open, bright windows glowing against the dusk, children playing in the yard, women stepping inside, carrying bags heavy with both belongings and burdens. I cut the ribbon and spoke once more, saying I had been bent but not broken, that the attempt to silence me had instead given me voice. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and when the news aired later, people across the town stopped me to say thank you. I did not need their thanks, but I accepted it as proof that pain can be transformed. Daniel held my hand that night and whispered that resilience was not just surviving, but building. I knew he was right. As winter returned and lights went up again in the windows, I thought of the Christmas when cruelty tried to define me, and I understood it had only marked the start of my new life. The house that once symbolized control now stood as defiance, a beacon. My parents remained in exile from my heart. My brother, a shadow of his old arrogance, and I no longer carried the weight of their judgment. I had chosen justice, not revenge, and healing, not silence. For every daughter told to surrender, for every child told, Blood matters more than dignity. The shelter's lights were my answer. I looked across the glowing rooms and whispered to myself that legacy is not what they tried to take. It is what I chose to give.